Let's get moving. We are talking today about computational governance. This is the third part in a series of webinars about data mesh and the potential for Irwin Data Intelligence to support you in that endeavor. And so today we're going to talk about computational governance. I think I'm jumping ahead, covering future slides. So let's see where we end up here. So here's our presenters. So may well have been on previous sessions. So I'm Neil Strange. I'm a sort of science graduate background. I've been in consultancy since I started work, both management consultancy and IT for many years. And I think that's why I've ended up in business intelligence, because it sort of straddles both worlds. I specialize in data platforms and analytics, and I have a deep interest in data mesh and other methods out there for building out data platforms. Richard, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I work for Irwin by Quest. I specialize in data intelligence practices. I now am in charge of the value attainment program that we have at Quest. We look at how we can get the best value out of the products that our customers are using, and they use them in various different ways depending on the industries and the maturity they're working at. So I'm very much interested in topics such as data mesh and how it can be implemented. And hopefully I have some input today, Neil.
Well, let's see. Right, let's move on. We have an audience on board. It would be good if you want to make any comments or ask questions, just post them into the chat, please, and we'll get round to them at the end of the presentation to get through. We've just got half an hour to get through this, and it's quite an extensive and interesting topic. Just to remind you, data mesh talks about 4 principles or 4 pillars. So talk about data as a product. So being a bit more serious about the data that you send out for analytics purposes. Domain-driven ownership of data. So that's kind of pushing out the ownership of the data to separate teams and giving them primacy over their data areas. And federated computational governance, which is all about how do you stop anarchy from coming in. Given that you've decentralized ownership, how do you have some control and standardization in there that enables what you're trying to achieve. And then finally, self-serve data platforms to make it easier for people to get into using the platform. And today's topic is the federated computational governance space. Now, just to move on quickly, there's a way of defining this. So, data governance as a topic is quite large, and data mesh takes sort of a smaller subset of the full topic area. And what we're looking at here is a kind of decentralized autonomous domains. So this is giving people across the organization ownership of their own subset of data, the data subject areas, but then working together with them collaboratively to govern the data that we have, and using, where possible, computational algorithms. In other words, automating as much of the governance as possible, or automating as much of the monitoring and checks as possible, so that the teams are able to work together and get instantaneous feedback about how well they're complying with governance in there. Nice thing to talk about, nice thing to say, but actually, what does that mean under the hood more practically? Well, these are the pillars, or the principles, and they all interact with each other. So it's a bit like a 4-legged stool. If you take one of the legs off, the stool will fall over. If you take one of these out of the mix, data mesh won't work. So you need to have all 4 elements present in your practice. And right in the middle here, we've got that federated computational governance. And what that does is it kind of designs the domain structure. So it identifies the data domains, so that you can pass ownership of those out to the domain-driven ownership pillar. Governance is about setting accountability. So who's responsible for what, and being able to define and enforce standards into those domains, so that the data that's worked on has a degree of interoperability about it. In terms of data as a product, well, we're looking at there at data contracts. So having a clear definition of what the data product is, maybe having standards around what a data contract is, and enforcing compliance, so making sure that data that does come out is compliant with the standards that have been set. And then finally, because we are dealing with multiple teams, we wish to have automation in there as much as possible around that governance in place. So making sure that any self-service data platforms that are there support automation around governance, checking data quality, and monitoring of compliance. So you've got 3 sets of dependencies in here, and each of these pillars depends on all the others to make up a locked set of practices. So today we're focusing on the governance aspects. Now, this works for me, so hopefully this will work with you too. There's a reason for having this diagram here. Governance is a complicated thing, and governance has lots of topics in it that you need to be aware of. The other thing is these are all interdependent on each other. So I always describe this as a daisy chain. That's what's illustrated here. And the point about a daisy chain is, you know, where's the top of it? So if I was to wear this daisy chain, what's the top and where's the bottom of that? And the answer is there is no top, there is no bottom. Top is where you choose to be. So just like with governance, you can choose to start anywhere in here. I could, for example, say, well, what we need in our organization is ownership, for example. And then if I lift up ownership as the key point, everything else follows and is connected with it. So you can't implement governance in one area without bringing in bits of the other areas as connected to it. So really, it doesn't matter where you start with governance. I mean, there are some common practices out there. For example, we often see data quality as an area that people look at. But it doesn't matter where you start implementing, eventually you'll bring everything in, and pretty quickly everything needs something addressed in there to make the whole governance structure work. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Richard, do you find this? Where do you see your clients start with governance?
Well, you're right. There's a lot of symptoms of problems might start with data quality. But then we do advocate a strategic sort of best practice of understanding from the foundations what's happening in your IT landscape. What are the rules? What are the regulations which are often most prominent? You know, so we ask about use cases. We ask about the end result you're aiming for. So there might be some firefighting. You might be picking up the daisy chain from the data quality side to say, let's fix some of these issues because we know about them. We're experienced. We want to address them. But then to try and make that more of an operational rhythm, you might then say, well, okay, where's the best place to source, to address those issues? Where's the source of truth for certain topics? Who's the producers of the data? And to know that, you might need to understand your data catalog. So it does depend customer to customer. But when people don't know, we do have some best practices that we would like to explain and to suggest and to work out what works best for each of our customers that talk to us. So
that makes sense.
anywhere, really. Yeah, you are right. It can be. You can look at any of these topics as a spark, really, to say, well, this is a need that we have in our company.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been told if you're going to manage something, the first thing you should do is understand what it is you're going to manage. So if you have data in an organization that you've got to manage, I think you're right. Maybe the first thing is to maybe get a list of what you have and where it is. Otherwise, things will pop up you didn't realize existed and surprise you. And you don't look very good to your management if you're not aware of what's out there. So yeah, you could be right. Data quality might be a pressing issue, but to get a handle on that, you may need to know what's there as well. To say, well, actually, we're only addressing this corner over here. There's a lot more in there, and we don't know what the quality is of what's out there. So essentially, I think you can't pick one without dragging bits of the others in here. Okay, so what I'm going to do, we're probably going to go through these in turn and do a bit of a dive inside each and see what's involved with that. So I was going to start off by looking at the data domains. So there's a pillar out there about domain ownership of data, but who sets the idea of what a domain is? Because if you get the wrong structure in there, you get too much cross dependency. I mean, there's an old programming mantra about coupling and cohesion. So coupling is the degree with which two domains have to exchange data to allow them to perform their tasks. So if I set up two artificial domains and there's a lot of data exchange between them, actually maybe they are the same domain in there. And cohesion's about it being a sort of cohesive concept. So you might set up a domain for finance, for example, which contains a lot of finance data in there, and you could say that was cohesive. However, finance is quite a big area, and you think about it, finance feeds from all kinds of places to capture the transactions. So it would have a lot of inputs from other domains, and you might say that's a necessary thing. But anyway, the point about this is any tooling you have out there needs to be able to capture domains and identify each object that you're working with and say which domain it's in. Second point in here is about, do we treat our data as one big data set, or can we actually compartmentalize it and say that's just finance data, that's just HR data, we don't care about allowing people access to that. It should be just hidden away inside teams, or do we need to share this information? And I'm thinking here, like with finance, you need budget information and spend information across the whole organization. So in a sense, you do need to share that data out there and work with it as one big model. And then finally, how do we get these domains set up in the first place? So they tend to be organized around business capability. What's your experience in there around domains?
I think to a lot of our customers, it's something which kind of gets bounced around for quite some time before there's some kind of direction to it. It's workshops quite a little while, and then the best way they want to use our solution. But in reality, what we'd recommend is that you would have different domains in our data catalog component, in the business glossary component, and then those products that you create in the marketplace would relate to that. In the data quality side as well, you might want to focus in and have different thresholds and alerts for different domains, because they would value possibly the same actual data differently from one domain to the other. So I think there's a design which we hope, and when we see things work the best, it's when there's a customer with a leader, with a strategy, with a goal in mind about what good looks like, and then we can align to that, and we can say, well, in that case, this is how you would break down the structure here. So there's it's something which I would advocate thinking about the long term. Don't just think about turning on a solution or working in fragmented space, but have it as a chapter, a multiple season series, if you see what I mean. If we're talking about box sets, have a plan that is going to make sense in the longer term.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess if you're going to start setting up domains, then people need to have accountability for them. So that's where we start to bring in this ownership concept.
Yes.
Data owners are those accountable for the data. Stewards are in the data, working on it, working on the quality and understanding the nuances of the data. And to make sure that people take their job seriously, you need some policy in there about what a domain is, what the responsibilities are for people. And then as you go down the data in your organization, it's deciding which domain the data belongs in, because sometimes that's a bit grey in terms of, well, it could be here, it could be there, or they both share it, or one has priority over the other in there. So I'm interested in, and I think DI has some really interesting functionality around defining policies. It allows you to set up families of policies and stuff in there, which you can then refer to inside your catalog. Is that true?
Yes, you can set different folders of policies and the way they can relate to regulations and to rules and to how are they, and to business terms, depending on the narrative that any customer would like to have. But I would expect governance teams or compliance teams to actually segregate these out in a way which makes sense to them, and how it's going to then align to the real world, when the real world being the physical landscape in the data catalog. So there's various different ways of formulating that sort of taxonomy of policies, if you will, of how they collate together.
And then you get visibility inside. As I'm thinking here about, day to day, a data engineer picks up a table, maybe a table of data called customer. They would say, this physical thing called customer is actually related to my glossary term customer. And then customer is subject to some policies. So there may be some GDPR type constraints that it applies to. You may have data retention policies. You may have ownership policies attached to that. If you can establish those linkages in there all the way down, then that particular attribute inside that table, where that fits into the governance structure. And if you have to change it, the impact that has, and who needs to know about it, and what its impact would be. So that's very useful to be able to do. I think the richer the policy set you can link to, the more useful that becomes.
Yes. Yes, and then that's the next slide, isn't it? The governance.
Next slide, I think I'll be jumping ahead of myself as always. So always do this. Yeah. So the policies, the stuff. I mean, what have you seen it used in the DI tool for
so
if policies?
You might be thinking, as you referred to retention and things like that. If you've got a multinational company, for example, you might well be looking at different retention laws in different countries, and some of them can vary quite considerably. You might be looking at 1 year or 7 years or infinity in some cases, when I looked at it in a previous life before Quest, and that means that you need to segregate that. You need to be able to have it in a way, that federated governance here, so that you could say, well, locally it's this amount of time we should keep it, or this is how secure we should keep it because of the country we're operating in, or we cannot transfer data from one country to another because of a particular rule. So that these things can be some of these things obviously you'd want across the entire company wide, but some of them you might want to have on a local level, and this allows you to have those types of relationships. And in terms of the impact assessment, you're looking at the way associations have been made to different components of the data catalog, and seeing what exists and therefore where they apply. You're effectively giving a recipe to somebody who works in IT, who looks after the systems, as to what they should be living up to. So they're not lawyers, they don't know anything about what governance might mean until they get something assigned to their particular system that they can look at. And they can say, right, well, I know now I should keep it this secure because it's got PII in it, or I know that I need to keep it this long because of this particular local rule. So yes, absolutely. Being that transparency to a lot of different users around the organization is really helpful.
Yeah. Okay. I can recall previous examples where I found this particularly useful as well. At one point, I was actually involved in developing part of the law that was going to go through Parliament for voting, and we had the law broken down into its individual bits, like policies, and mapping that down to the data we were working with. And the impact assessment was exceptionally useful in there. And I guess we're going to have standards like GDPR has legal backing behind it. We'll have ISO standards we may want to bring in. We can link those to how we're going to implement them. So if GDPR says you've got a right to forget, you may have an internal policy about how that's going to be actioned. And then that itself then links down to data items that you're working with. So I find that whole thing exceptionally useful when it comes to when someone says, I want to change something, to say, have you thought about this? Otherwise, it's a bit hit and miss, isn't it? Whether you remember or not that something applies to that data item.
Well, there should be some kind of operational approach to when people raise those data subject access requests, or the right to be forgotten, or anything like that. So where do people look? So if you've got a process that says, follow this, check these systems, search for these IDs based on the person who's raised it, there's a methodology there that can be documented and linked, so that you don't have to basically message people who work in a particular department, and they have to think off the top of their heads. There's actually something documented and understood, and is therefore available to be used in defense of anything. A supervisory authority might ask you, how do you respond to these requests? And you've got something written down. So
That's
that's
it.
helpful.
And you're required to do things like DPIAs, so data processing impact assessments when you start new projects in there as well, and so forth. Anyway, it's really interesting on the impact there. Let's move on. Security and compliance is an important part of governance. It's a separate topic from interoperability. So we've talked a little bit already about GDPR. Another interesting possibility is tagging data. So actually capturing metadata that describes the data that you have. And I guess the Irwin DI has, at its roots, is a metadata management tool. So how does tagging work in there, and how useful have you seen that?
There's a couple of aspects to this. There's something that you can do from the academic side of the glossary. So you can say by dictionary definition, this is a business term, which is PII. And therefore you've tagged it, and you can then cascade it to any of the columns and the tables that exist in the physical landscape. And we have AI within the solution which proposes associations between the business glossary, which has those terms, and the catalogue, which has the physical landscape. So that accelerates the way that we can search, and the way that you can then cascade that PII against to the catalogue. So that is very helpful. And in the data quality module, again, we can identify where PII might exist, or critical data elements based on the volume that they're being utilized across the landscape can be identified. So by profiling reality, using AI, you sort of remove the bias, which might be in a lot of people's minds about what the world looks like, and look at the facts. And that's really helpful in identifying things and bringing governance to the areas that really do matter.
That's interesting. And I think certainly in the past, working with the tool to do scraping, so inspection of what's really there, the schemas of databases that are in the data in the company, to be able to scrape that in and reconstruct source systems and identify and analyze that data has been a real time saver, which otherwise we'd have to do manually. Okay, we'll move on to interoperability. So we've talked a bit about domains, so giving teams the right to manage their own data, but very often you need to exchange data between these domains to allow, for example, customer data may be referenced by a whole set of other domains, and they need that for their analytic needs. But you also may have some centralized reporting, maybe going up to the executive, and they need to see across all kinds of domains to report a coherent set of information up. And therefore the data needs to be exposed in a consistent format with standard keys attached to them, so that data can be aggregated properly for that reporting. So there's a whole kind of sort of data standards needed in the middle there to do that. So things like, if I'm going to have a customer information, then I would expect the customer to have a first name and a given name attached to them, possibly a date of birth if you're allowed to add that, maybe address information. Again, that's PII type data, but you might want to define those standards so that when data is exchanged, it integrates properly from other sources of the same data. And you would organize that around a common glossary. So you have a common thing called customer. There might be 20 tables in your systems that have customer data in, but when you start to integrate them and bring them together, they're brought together in a common way. And I think the bottom point there is about what's called a canonical model. So if you're not into data architecture and data modeling, you may not have come across this term before. But a canonical model is a sort of a logical model of your data in your organization that isn't based on any system at all. It's just like a reference model against which you can map other systems in. So a canonical model basically models your business from a top-down point of view. And from there, you can evolve your standards for data exchange in there. I don't know if you've seen much of this, Richard, in your experience working with DI?
We do use certain modules for reference data, so and mappings for
Hmm.
various things. The transformations that occur from one data source to another, we reverse engineer so that we can see what it looks like in the first source and then the second, and it ideally brings some consistency to the way these things are mapped through. We also use the different semantics in the data quality module to understand what things look like as they go across and where there might be some errors in the way that things are flowing. So that the generative AI that we use there will propose better data if there's errors in it based on the many thousands of other rows that exist. You look for commonalities and suggestions. It does
Yeah.
proposals for remediation. So
Hmm.
there's various different things there and how things are linked. We look at those kind of scenarios and we try and work out what the common situation should be. And then obviously with the associations from the glossary to the catalogue, we can see what the definition is of a particular term and where it exists in multiple situations in real life.
Hmm.
Synonyms and things like that for different domains, different departments, so that people can say, I'm looking for a term, I found the result, but I now know also that it's referred to as with a different definition in the department next door to me. So I can talk their language as well and understand why there might be confusion perhaps in the conversations.
I think another thing that comes out of this as well is the need for enforcing data quality standards. So if keys are missing from one system, that's not a good thing because you can't match. I mean, we all have this issue where maybe your customer is identified in one system as number 100. In another system, it's labeled as 200, and you can't match them other than doing some sort of fuzzy matching in there.
Mm.
Um, and being able to run automated standards checking, automated data quality checks are an important part of the computational governance side.
Yeah.
I know that DI has a whole functionality around data quality. Maybe if you could explain how that can help.
Yes, so we use different connectors. So we would want to, I think one of your later slides actually, checking the clock,
The
actually
next one.
talks about it. Yeah.
Yeah, let's move on.
Yeah, so this is a picture of what the mind map looks like within the data intelligence suite. So that's obviously how the different assets are connected. Now, if we were leaning on that against not only the policy narratives that are shown there, but also onto the data catalog, we might know which of the sources we want to scan for data quality reasons, to answer your question. And we might have then decide to scan them and use the quality rules which are listed in the glossary, but influence them against the data quality module itself to understand exactly where the errors lie and where there could be remediation ideas which will come from it. So there's a lot of out-of-the-box measures which we have available, some of which our customers probably haven't considered using in real life. And so having that available alongside the logical rules that can be put in place, alongside SQL rules that might exist already in the customer's landscape, we can bring all of that together and put measures against things, thresholds, which then spark off alerts and issues that can be tracked and workflowed through. So there's this whole world of understanding where good and bad data is. And therefore, obviously, if you track it in the right way, you do some proper root cause analysis with the data lineage, then you can really make a significant difference to the organization. Capturing it in the right place at the right time and monitoring it indefinitely are a good approach, obviously.
Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so yeah, moving on then, the last couple of points on the governance side. On the automation, I think this is very important. If you've got lots of teams out there, you need to automate some of the checking on compliance. Otherwise, there's a never-ending job of people auditing and visually inspecting stuff or trusting the teams not to break the rules. And you know what that always ends up as for expediency. So you need to understand, how your data flows across the piece, from source into various domains and how it's used. Ideally, you might even want to generate code in there, potentially generate some ETL if it's clear, and potentially also provisioning of access to the tooling. through automation. And we're getting into the data quality tests. So being able to run repeated tests and monitor the changes over time, schedule metadata scraping and analysis on a schedule, because as you know, source systems do change their schemas very often, and it'd be nice to know if they've done that and if they're breaching any data contracts that you've got in place. And I guess that's linked into the point at the bottom. It's continually monitoring and checking and doing and auditing, and allowing us to compare over time to see if things are changing and whether things are getting better or worse. So have you seen that in use in organizations?
I think there's a great need to have best practices for managing change and automating as much as possible. Certainly. So if you've got that, if we have connectors which you can scan the data sources, we have connectors that scan the data to get the data lineage. You can schedule scans once they've been set up. You can then do version control against each. You can use that for the impact assessment, looking upstream and downstream. So if there's where you've got policies in place to say, do not change anything unless you've looked at the impact assessment, you've looked downstream, and some people might need to get approvals from like a DPIA or something, or they might need to just be alerted, communicated to, so that there's more awareness of the larger organization that you might not have been aware of if it wasn't all written down and built together in the data catalog. So a lot of automation we can bring in that respect. And then we would expect a customer to say, well, we have a change management forum. We've got data governance offices and data governance committees and things like that. So the right decisions are at the right board using the right screens and visuals. So they're well informed as things change in the real life.
That's really interesting. I've just noted.